I'm going to make the assertion today that the prescribed drugs that we were overloaded our population with are just as bad at causing mental damage as the metals and chemicals we've contaminated our environment with. So at the end of this lecture, I hope you'll give me some feedback and tell me, did I make my case?
I'm really thrilled to welcome Dr. Joe Pizzorno, who's one of the world's leading authorities on science-based natural integrative medicine. He founded and served 22 years as president of Bastyr University, which is the country's first and largest fully accredited university of natural medicine. He's the co-author of the Encyclopedia of Natural Medicine, over 2 million copies sold, and Textbook of Natural Medicine. He's the chair of the board of directors of the Institute for Functional Medicine and founder and editor-in-chief of Integrative Medicine, a clinician's journal, the leading peer-reviewed journal in integrative medicine. He travels worldwide, consulting, lecturing, and promoting science-based natural medicine. His most recent book, The Toxin Solution: How Hidden Poisons in the Air, Water, Food, and Products We Use Are Destroying Our Health and What We Can Do to Fix It, provides the proven detox and tailored methods he's developed to heal toxic overload and restore health. His most recent book is Clinical Environmental Medicine for Healthcare Professionals. So I'm really thrilled to welcome you, Dr. Pizzorno. It's such an important topic.
Well, thank you for the invitation to speak this year. So I've been looking at mental health for a long period of time. When I started Bastyr University way back over 40 years ago, one of the first courses that I taught was called Healing Systems. And in this course, kind of look at each of the systems of the body, talk about what's supposed to do, what it looks like when it's not working properly, how I can test that with objective measures as necessary. Why is it not working properly? How do you get it working properly again? So when I was first looking at the neurological system, one of the earliest ones, of course, looking back 40 years ago, we were looking at things like diet and exercise and sleep, and just starting to be aware of homocysteine. We're looking at foods, not just in terms of having nutrients, but also in terms of how foods are being prepared. Like you've heard about advanced glycated end products. So when you brown your foods, you produce these advanced glycated end products, and they increase the rate of mental degeneration. So that was all going pretty fine, and I was enjoying teaching the class to students every year, and every year I'd add some more to it. You know, a little bit about toxins. Lead was the obvious one, but we were doing pretty good about getting lead out of the environment and not paying as much attention to the toxins as other things. Then about 15 years ago, one of the wealthiest men in Canada invited me to develop a natural medicine wellness program for his employees. So he had 4,500 oil field workers up in mainly Alberta, Canada. So the guy's name's Alan Mark, and I said, well, Alan, you know, I'm a true believer in natural medicine, but I also believe in being objective. So I want to assess the health status of your people. How much can I spend? He said, blank check. It's a blank check. He said, yes, if you can convince me that we should run the laboratory test on my employees, I will pay for it out of my own pocket. So I ran what would be today the equivalent of about $3,000 of lab tests on each and every one of these 4,500 oil field workers. And since they were oil field workers, I had been assuming that, I just kind of conflated in my mind, well, oil field workers aren't the same as people working in oil refineries. So I started testing for environmental toxins. Seemed a logical thing to do. Well, it turns out they're oil field workers. So they get in their pickup trucks, go out in the prairie somewhere in Alberta, and they check to make sure that the pumps are working properly. So they weren't actually getting chemical exposure like they would have gotten if they're working in the refineries for producing the oil and gas. But wait a minute, I was finding all this toxicity. So as I started digging into it, why have I seen so much toxicity? I started to realize that they're getting the toxicity because many of them were working in the oil fields as a second job to support the family farms, which were no longer viable. So in these family farms, what are they doing? Herbicides, pesticides, all these chemicals that are being put onto the food for them to grow the food, well, they're in their bodies as well. I was actually seeing damage in their bodies. So then I started looking at, well, wait a minute, I've got to pay more attention to environmental toxins. So in the ensuing years, every few years I'm asked to give a lecture on environmental toxins and neurodegeneration. I dig up all the recent research. So today I'm going to talk about what's the latest that I found. I'll go back to some of the key stuff, but I'll be talking about the latest that I found. Okay, first, in terms of conflicts of interest, I'm a science advisor for both BioClinic Naturals and for Mosaic Diagnostics, although I'm not recommending any of their products here. So what's going on? We have a worldwide epidemic of mental disorders. We know that toxins damage neurons and decrease brain function. But not only have we increased our exposure to neurotoxins, we have been systematically removing the protective molecules from the food supply that help us get rid of these toxins more effectively and help prevent them damaging our neurons. And so I'll talk about some key interventions at the end. And I suspect the key interventions I'm going to recommend to you are going to be a bit surprising, okay? Because everybody's looking for what's the latest vitamin, what's the latest herb. I'm going to make a somewhat different recommendation. So note about the data. Everything I'm showing you with two exceptions, I'll show you what slides are exception. This is all human data. And it's all primarily US data because the US has done a great job of collecting a lot of data on environmental toxins in our population for decades. So I now lecture literally all over the world on environmental medicine. And when I go to a country to lecture, I look and see, well, what's their highest levels of toxins? But what's interesting is virtually no other country in the world has assessed the toxic load in their population. Now, you find some research studies here and there where they say, oh, like in Australia, oh, they have higher levels of PPDEs. Look in Canada, where they have higher levels of lead. So you find some countries that have found higher levels of a toxin, but the problem is they haven't checked all the toxins. They just checked a few. Now, most countries have determined what toxins are in the air and the water, which is very good, but they haven't taken the second step. The last step, that is what's in our population. So here in the US, we have this population toxin book. It's two several thousand page volumes, and they get updated about every 6 months. So this is what's called the data I'll be showing today is the 2019 one, but realistically, it's updated every 6 months, but periodically they then do a huge integrated update. So the data I'm going to be showing you is from this book. So what do we know about environmental toxins? And more importantly, what do we know about these epidemics? Autism going up relentlessly, Parkinson's going up relentlessly, Alzheimer's disease going up relentlessly. Virtually every chronic disease has increased in virtually every age group in the last 50 years, especially neurological. Why? Why do we have so much neurological degeneration? Well, here's how you destroy the brain in 6 easy steps. Poison neurons, neurotoxins, damage the mitochondria so they can't produce the ATP necessary for the neurons to work properly and to protect themselves from environmental toxins. Overactivate the microglia. These are the white cells in the brain. When you overactivate the microglia, these white cells will then start damaging normal tissues and start releasing a lot of oxidative chemicals. Increase oxidative stress. Decrease BDNF. That's the brain-derived neurotrophic growth factor. So our wonderful bodies constantly renew. Our brains renew about 1% every year, unless we have high levels of neurotoxins, at which point the brain does not regenerate, and we get quicker brain degeneration. And then the final thing is sabotage protective mechanisms. Now, obviously, in the hour I have available, I can't cover all of these, but I'm going to cover some areas which I think are really, really important and very, very relevant. So the toxins. So you saw on the list in my title, molds, the perfluorinated substances, metals, and chemicals, but I'm adding a new category that's not in the title. I'm adding drugs. Because as I was looking at the latest research on these environmental toxins damaging the brain, I started seeing a bunch of commonly prescribed drugs popping up. Matter of fact, I'm going to make the assertion today that the prescribed drugs that we were overloaded our population with are just as bad at causing mental damage as the metals and chemicals we've contaminated our environment with. So at the end of this lecture, I hope you'll give me some feedback and tell me, did I make my case? So I think you're all aware that Dr. Walter Crinan and I, just before he unfortunately passed away, wrote a textbook called Clinical Environmental Medicine. And what we tried to do here is compile the research on how much disease is being caused by environmental toxins, how do you diagnose it, how do you get it out of the body. So then we started looking at both diseases and conditions. So what's a condition? It's like a bunch of physiological dysfunctions that are causing damage. They haven't gotten to a point where we're calling it a disease. Okay, so diseases, ADHD, autism, amyotrophic sclerosis, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, conditions, cognitive decline, dementia, headache, IQ loss in children, mood disorders, depression, mania, all those kinds of things, and motor neuron disorders. Now, what's interesting about these environmental toxins is that we tend to be most susceptible to them based on the stage of life that we're in. So toxins that are particularly bad for the fetus aren't necessarily going to be the worst toxins for the adult. Now, I'm not going to be clear. I'm not saying just because it's adult toxins not causing damage to the fetus or child, and just because the child toxin doesn't mean it's not causing damage to the adult. What we're looking at, what are the preponderance of damage? They do tend to differentiate a bit. But now, for the first time, I'm going to be lecturing on drugs, both prescription and over-the-counter. These things are now, they're being prescribed so much now that they are causing as much damage as the accidental toxins. Okay, now let's get into the environmental toxins first. Okay, so what are the environmental toxins? So when I go to do a lecture, first thing I do is I go into PubMed and say, look at what's the latest review articles on environmental toxins and mental disorders. What came up first was arsenic. Now, it was just adventitious. It was just an accident that happened. But the reason I was paying so much attention to that is that most people don't realize that 35% of our population in the United States has arsenic levels known to increase risk for disease. This is not a rare toxin. This is not uncommon. This is actually the worst toxin in the world right now in terms of causing disease. And sure enough, it causes neurotoxicity. How does it do it? Mitochondrial damage, oxidative stress, lipid peroxidation, inappropriate apoptosis, decreases thiamine function, decreases acetylcholinesterase activity. So a bunch of these activities. So then you look at, well, does body load of arsenic correlate with environmental toxins? Now, this tends to be very difficult to do because arsenic is one of those short-term toxins. When we're talking about toxins, we typically think metals or chemicals, but actually a more clinically useful way to think about them short-term versus long-term. So arsenic is a short-term toxin. That means that the body can get rid of it very easily. The half-life of arsenic in the body is only 2 to 4 days. So one of the problems with a lot of research on arsenic is that, do they measure the arsenic levels when the person is being exposed, or do they measure them when it happened to be convenient for the test to be run? So, for example, here I live in Western Washington. Well, in Eastern Washington, there are areas with huge amount of arsenic in the water supply. So you have a farmer working in Eastern Washington, being poisoned by arsenic, decide to come into the big city, into Seattle, to see this expert doctor in environmental medicine. And while they're there, they say, well, before we go see Dr. Pizzorno, we're going to go to the grocery store. Oh, there's this new show we wanted to see. They may not see me until they've been in Seattle for 4 days, at which point most of the arsenic is gone. So the studies which are most predictive of arsenic or most correlative of arsenic exposure with environmental toxin, with the disease, they tend to look at more long-term measures like toenail levels of arsenic or how much arsenic is in the environment around the people. Here's one that's looking at the amount of arsenic in the soil, okay? And what they found was that direct correlation between the amount of arsenic in the soil, and look at some of these numbers, arsenic in the soil, those in the highest quartile, 9-fold increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. Okay, then how about something like arsenic in toenails? And what we find is as arsenic in toenails goes up, so does the amount of Alzheimer's disease. But what's particularly interesting is they found a correlation with selenium as well. Now, I don't know exactly what this means. We do know that selenium is inversely correlated with cancer, but when selenium levels get too high, all of a sudden cancer levels start going up dramatically as well. I suspect what we're seeing here is that some of the samples that we're looking at happen to have high selenium levels, to the point where selenium was actually toxic. Okay, so you might say, well, arsenic, is it really that common? So here's that database I just showed you, and this is look at the threshold. Threshold is 10 micrograms of arsenic per liter of urine, and right there, that's where it is. 35% of the population exceeds that. And if you look at what's going on, the levels have been going up. Why the levels been going up? because we've been substituting high arsenic rice flour with wheat flour because people are now avoiding gluten. Okay. Now, back in 2012, 2010, I should say, there was a change in their methodologies, and every toxin that I've looked at dropped 25% in 2010. So they changed their methodology. I've not been getting anybody to tell me what the changes were. So if you're looking at trying to do comparative data, you got to make sure you look at the comparable methodologies. But nonetheless, what we find is 35% of the population above the threshold. And where's it coming from? Water, chicken, and rice. You might say, water? Really, from water? 10% of the public water supplies that have reported their levels have shown that they have arsenic levels above 10 micrograms per liter of water. Well, isn't that interesting? Remember I said also, of those that have reported the arsenic levels, only 50% of public water supplies have reported the arsenic levels. Why is that? I suspect because this $50 test would have revealed that their water levels contaminated with arsenic. How do you get 35% of the population with elevated levels of arsenic? Because the water they're drinking is contaminated. Okay, so it's not just mental disorders. How about cancer? Here's what that is done with Native Americans. They found a direct correlation. Look at these things, direct correlation between arsenic levels and the major cancers that kill people. And they determined that 1/4 to 1/3 of the major cancers, lung cancer, prostate cancer, et cetera, are due to arsenic. All right, pesticides. We're all exposed to pesticides. Even if you're like me, extremely carefully avoiding pesticides, growing as much modern food as possible, you're still going to have some pesticide exposure. How about organochlorine pesticides? Well, as the organochlorine levels go up, so does dementia. How about Parkinson's disease? As people's levels of organophosphates go up, so does Parkinson's. Well, this is where's all our food being grown? They're called the breadbasket. Look at what's going on in the water supplies where our food is being grown. It's contaminated with these organophosphate pesticides. Hugely problematic. How about PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls? These things have half-lives of 2 to 20 years in humans. What's the best predictor of a person's PCB levels? The amount of farm fish they're eating. I see as farm fish levels go up, so does the incidence of dementia. And now I want to talk about drugs, both prescription and over-the-counter drugs. Okay, because we have a huge problem, folks. These are day-to-day chemicals we are intentionally putting into our bodies. They're causing dementia. So I'm going to go through these classes. First, I'll talk about the anticholinergics. Okay, anticholinergics. Now, you may not think about these being real common. They're not that commonly prescribed, but they are commonly prescribed enough. And what do we see? Huge study done in France. Look at this: 7,000 older men and women. What they found was that as their use of these anticholinergic drugs went up, so did incidence of dementia. Why is that? Guess what? They're organophosphate pesticides. Organophosphates were developed in World War I for chemical warfare. So now we're spraying these things on our food supply, and we expect there's not going to be any effect. Now, you might say, well, it's not that big. It's only 1.6-fold increased risk. That's true. That's only one class of drugs. We're basically giving huge amounts of drugs to our populations. So this one's looking at anticholinergics and cognitive impairment. And what they found was that if people are carriers of ApoE4 and they're homozygous for ApoE4 allele, well, guess what? 77% increased risk for those people. So they're more susceptible. How about increased mortality and dementia? And again, looking at, this one's done out of the UK, looking at anticholinergics. As anticholinergics are used, the risk for cognitive decline goes up as well. Well, okay, you might say, well, those aren't so common. Well, how about antidepressants? Those are common. And they're looking at mild cognitive impairment and dementia. Those are using the particular drug, trazodone. Sorry, I'm not great at pronouncing these drug names. 3.46 increased risk of dementia in older women. Okay. How about antidepressants and dementia? Now, just look at a bunch of different categories of antidepressants, look at dementia. And as you can see, all these ones that they're looking at these very studies, they found that when older adults were compared to people who were not using antidepressants, 3.25-fold increased risk of dementia. Now, yes, I realize there's some confounding factors here, because most likely people with dementia, with depression, also have higher levels of neurotoxins. But when we give them the antidepressants, we make it worse. Not saying don't use antidepressants. Sometimes people need them, but realize they're toxins. We have to protect the body from these toxins. How about antidepressants and cognition? There's another big study looked at, over 1,200 community-dwelling older women. What they found was that those who can use antidepressants, guess what? Way more cognitive decline. Now, here's a great study. I love these studies where it's a prospective study. They look at people over time to determine when they are developing their mental dysfunction. And what they're looking at here is women who did use antidepressants, ones who were depressed, and then they looked at using drugs. And what they found is the more drugs they use, the more quicker their their memory dysfunction increased. How about antibiotics? You say antibiotics? Yes. Antibiotics poison mitochondria. One reason why we feel tired after using antibiotics is because they're poisoning mitochondria. So this is a really good study. I find it so very interesting. Looking at 40 different antibiotics, they then looked at the ability of the mitochondria to produce ATP. So as you know, our bodies are enzyme machines. And those enzymes and machines require ATP. No ATP, enzymes don't work, and we get sick. We have less vitality. So you see, as we're looking at these various antibiotics, this is the amount of decreased production of ATP. No surprise, we feel tired. Well, look at the increased oxidative stress, reactive oxidative species. Look at all these increased numbers. Look at the MDA. This is a measure of lipid damage. And how about 8-OHDG? What is this 8-hydroxydeguanine? This is a measure of DNA damage. So what's happening when we're giving people antibiotics, we're actually damaging the mitochondrial DNA. So not only are the mitochondria less able to produce ATP, but now they're producing way more oxidative stress and they're damaging the DNA, so they're having trouble to even regenerate themselves. But there's some good news here. By the way, this is a cell culture result. Reproduce the same thing in rabbits. But when they gave the rabbits 50%, gave rabbits an N-acetylcysteine, they decreased the damage by 50%. So NAC is one of our best agents for decreasing neurological damage from all kinds of reasons because it increases glutathione production, and glutathione is critical. Okay, and we all know that the antibiotics mess up the microbiome. Why is that important? Well, because when you mess up the microbiome, you start producing all these neurotoxic molecules from the foods in our diet. Very problematic. Now, how about at this point, you've been thinking, well, not very common drugs. Now we're starting to get to more and more common drugs. How about protein pump inhibitors? A huge portion of population is on these things. There's one study looked at the increased use of them over just a 13-year period of time, went from 2.9% of the population to 7.8% of people in the ages of 40 to 64. Whoa, well, what's going on with these things? Well, look at these numbers, look at these correlations. What we find is look at memory impairment. And those who are using protein pump inhibitors have a 3.28-fold increased risk for memory impairment. Okay, so if you're seeing memory impairment, that means most mental functions aren't going properly because we've got to use our brains, memory in our brains, for our brains to function properly. Well, how about some direct actions looking at PPI effects on CNS? And what we see is, sure enough, increased incidence of dementia, the more PPIs people use. Here's another one looking at PPIs inducing B12 deficiency. Now, we're all aware of the critical importance of B12 for neurological function, particularly homocysteine. Well, when you give people PPIs, the PPIs are basically poisoning parietal cells in the stomach. So those parietal cells now are no longer producing hyaluronic acid, but they're now no longer producing intrinsic factor. So now we know that if you have an intrinsic factor, the B12 absorption goes down dramatically. And you can still get B12 into people even when they don't have intrinsic factor if you give them enough, because you'll absorb about 3% of the B12 even without an intrinsic factor. But 3% is not near enough. So what happens? We get higher levels of homocysteine, which then damages the neurons. But interesting, I found this study, just pulled up, I was looking at the study, I think preparing for this lecture. It turns out that B12 not only limits the production of homocysteine, but it binds directly to the tau protein that's so critical in the neural fibril tangles, we see in Alzheimer's disease. So we're looking at B12, and we find that as B12 levels go up, so does homocysteine, but also, I'm sorry, as B12 levels go down, homocysteine goes up, but also MMA goes up, methylmalonic acid. So I want a clinical pearl for everybody. Don't just measure homocysteine, you must also measure MMA, because MMA goes up when we're unable to convert B12 to all of its active forms. Okay, so when people have elevated levels of MMA, we've got to give them not just B12, but also all the activated forms of B12. Now, how about magnesium? We know how incredibly important magnesium is to mitochondrial function, to hundreds of enzyme systems, to muscle relaxation, etc. Well, we get people PPIs, not only do they have decreased absorption of B12, they also have decreased absorption of magnesium. And it's pretty significant. Look at study after study, all showing the same thing, decreased levels of magnesium with PPIs. How about statins? I thought it was so funny when about 15 years ago, they're finding, oh, look, all this wonderful research showing that statins don't have much toxicity. And look, they decrease people's cholesterol levels. That's really good. Everybody should be prescribed statins because they're so wonderful. Well, now as we look at people using statins, we find the more statins people use, the more dementia they have. We look at people with Alzheimer's disease, there's an inverse correlation between cholesterol levels and Alzheimer's disease. Isn't that interesting? So we find the more we give people statins, the more toxicity they have. So why are statins being recommended? Oh, I should have included the slide. Sorry, I didn't. Next time I'll hope I remember to do it. So there was a study done about 10 years ago that proved that statin drugs were incredibly safe, and everybody should be prescribed them like candy. They should be part of our anti-aging protocol. So what they did was, it was max day 10,000 person study, okay? And this 10,000 person study, they showed ADRs less than 1%. Very impressive. And that's what you look at the abstract, and that's what you see. And by the way, if you're interested in looking at research, you can't just look at the abstracts. You actually have to look at the data tables in the studies, assuming they didn't fake those as well. As you know, I'm an editor of a journal. We're now seeing more and more instances where the actual data is being faked, which is making it harder for us to get good data. Anyway, so fortunately, the data was there. What they showed was that here's how they did the study. They first started with an open label trial. What that means is everybody got the statin drug. And then anybody who had an adverse reaction was removed from the study, and those who did not get an adverse reaction were then enrolled in the placebo-controlled study where half got statin, half got placebo. And they found no reactions whatsoever, and less than 1%. Yes. How many people, remember, we started with 10,000 people, how many people were removed from the study because in the open label trial, they had adverse reaction? Give you a second to think about it. 3,000. So they removed 30% of the people from the study who were having reactions to statin drugs. Of course, some were placebo reactions, but the majority were reactions to statin drugs, remove them from the study, and oh, guess what? The people left over don't have reaction. And what did we find with post-marketing surveillance? About 25% of people had an adverse reaction to statin drugs. So this is an example of how a drug, which can be beneficial in some situations, I want to be very clear. The study was done on primary prevention. Now, post-heart attack prevention, statin drugs clearly help. Primary prevention, a person is 6 times more likely to have an adverse reaction than have any benefit from statin drugs in a primary prevention. If you don't believe me, go to PubMed, look up my article, you'll see the references in the article. It's not, I'm not making this up, I'm just quoting other researchers. Okay, so statins and cognitive impairment, dose dependent. And they found that people in the high intensity statin therapy, you may recall a few years ago, said, hey, these statin drugs are so good, let's do high intensity, let's get people in the really narrow range, get the cholesterol done, how wonderful it's going to be. 41% of them got cognitive impairment. 41% got cognitive impairment. Not a good idea. Now, how about the Z drugs? Kiki was meant to talk about that a little earlier. Now, so these are the drugs being used for various purposes, sleep, etc., and anxiety, all these kinds of things. What they find was that though the more of these people are using these Z drugs, the more neurological damage they're getting, and they're even getting increased rate of death. And what they're also doing, they're also getting increased risk of suicide. So these drugs are not without their side effects. I'm going to be real clear. I'm not anti-drugs. Drugs have their places, okay? But we have to do a lot more to promote people's health so they don't need these drugs. And you know, by my textbook in natural medicine, in my 2,000-page volume with probably 15,000 reference, we show people how to use nutrition, how to use detoxification to reverse people's diseases so they don't have to use these drugs. Or if they not able to totally get rid of the disease, we can dramatically decrease the amount of these drugs. So this has been done in a bunch of countries. It's been done in Taiwan, this one's done in Korea. We're all showing the same things. How about traffic fatalities? So we're using the drugs that are causing mental dysfunction. Well, guess what? When they're driving the car, they're going to be more dangerous. And this is looking at, you can see at this graph, those who are using the drugs versus those who weren't using the drugs. Those using the drugs dramatically increase incidence of traffic fatalities. Then how about polypharmacy, where people are using multiple drugs? There's a significant portion of the population, okay? So what we're seeing is people using a bunch of drugs, and that is for every additional drug a person is taking, 35% increased risk of balance impairment. And what's balance impairment mean? The neurological system has been damaged. How about ataxia? Okay, it means you can't walk properly because your neurons aren't functioning, your motor neurons and sensory neurons aren't functioning properly. Look at some of these drugs that are being prescribed to people, okay? 23-fold increased risk of ataxia when using some of these drugs, okay? How about homocysteine and dementia? We're all aware of that. As homocysteine levels go up, so does the incidence of dementia. It's a nice, clean, linear chart, okay? Now there's, I'm not getting into the details of this particular study. We're looking at non-linear versus linear effects. Doesn't matter. It's all going up. And you can see why I recommend that homocysteine should be right in this range, a lot of 8 to 10, 6 to 10, right in that range. Probably the best place for us to be with the homocysteine. But you can see as homocysteine levels go up, so does the incidence of dementia. Well, how about drugs that increase homocysteine? Clustamide, cholesterol, levodopa, metformin, methotrexate, and here's one of ours, niacin, folks, nitrous oxide, etc. The point I'm trying to make is thiazide diuretics. Okay. These are drugs that are commonly prescribed, and they're increasing homocysteine levels, which means they're indiscriminately increasing damage to the brain. And one reason why this is not as recognized as it should be is because the damage is so widespread. It's not like, oh, there's one exact data source, one exact signal. No, a bunch of these signals all increased. And you add them all together, damage. Now, how about the overactivation of microglia? Okay, so these are the resident macrophages in the brain. They play an incredibly important role in protecting the brain from infection and removing damaged tissues that have to be replaced in order for the brain to regenerate. Remember, I said the brain regenerates about 1% per year. Well, microglia play a big role in that, and they just get rid of the damaged neurons. They replace the good neurons as long as BDNF is around. So we started looking at microglia overactivation in PubMed. You see thousands of studies. And what is the best way to increase microglia activation? Well, let me show you a list. Rotenone and paraquat. Oh, go look at this. These insecticides and rodenticides being exposed. Lipopolysaccharides. What are these coming from? They're coming from bacteria in the gut. So a person has overgrowth of the wrong bacteria in the gut, and they have excess gut permeability, which, as you know, is a major portion of the population. Guess what? They're overactivated in the microglia. All-time naturopathic adage, disease begins in the gut. And they were right. When the gut is messed up, we produce all these toxins that get into the body and cause all this indiscriminate damage. Next thing we're doing is we're sabotaging our protective mechanisms. So remember I mentioned the microglia overactivation. This is a big issue. So the microglia are overactivated. When I say microglia overactivation, remember, these are the mast cells as well are getting overactivated. So people who have allergies are suffering the same kinds of experiences. So look at all these flavonoids in the food supply. that protect the microglia from overactivation. I assume we're all aware of the use of quercetin for people with allergies to help decrease overactivation and production of histamine by mast cells. Well, we have apigenin, bacalin, berberine, phycin, curcumin, epigallocatechin, quercetin, resveratrol. You've heard about all these, right? You've heard about these phytonutrients, how wonderful they are. These phytonutrients are in our food supply. And here are all these examples of all these phytonutrients in our food supply doing all these things to protect the microglia from overactivation. What have we done to our food supply? Here's a great study, and I apologize if any of you have seen the study, me talk about the study before, but I love the study because it's so good. So what this study did, it was done in a greenhouse so that the plants were all in the same place. So control of light, water, air, soil, everything's the same. Seeds, everything's the same. The only thing that changed was the fertilizer. One plot got chemicals and one plot got organics for fertilization. And then what they did, which I thought was really interesting, they tracked the flavonoids over the whole year period of time. Because sometimes if you look at a flavonoid in a plant, it's going to vary hugely by the time of the year, and not particularly surprising. So yeah, as you can see here, these are the blue lines are the organically grown foods, and you can see that, yep, they change over the time of the year, okay, but they're all there. The red ones are these same flavonoids in chemical grown foods. I'm not using the term conventionally grown anymore. I'm trying to take that out of my lexicon. We're saying instead chemical grown foods. Look, many of these protective mechanisms, protecting our neurons, protecting our microglia, protecting our mitochondria, they have left the food supply because we're growing foods chemically rather than organically. So combination of add in neurotoxins, decrease protective mechanisms. What do you get? Highest burden of chronic disease, highest burden of mental disease ever in human history. Problems. Okay, so here's another study. Looked at a bunch of chemical grown foods versus regular grown foods. Looked at a bunch of different flavonoids and carotenoids and protective molecules that we're still learning about. Look at them. They're all dramatically higher in the organically grown foods. What's higher in chemically grown foods? Cadmium, nitrates, protein. Okay, well, that's kind of useful, higher levels of protein, but with more cadmium and with a lot less of the other things, not such a good thing. And now we're gonna get to the area where I may be surprising you, but I'm starting to change my lectures a bit. What do you do about this? So I probably said, first off, naturally treat the underlying disease so they don't need the drugs. Okay, anyway, avoidance. So part of that avoidance is avoiding the need for the drugs, but just avoiding these toxins. Facilitate detoxification and excretion, increase dietary phytonutrients. Let's see where we go with this. So I want to emphasize again the huge role of environmental toxins every day. We're getting these toxins every day. You say, well, it's only 9 nanograms per day. That's fine. But when you have a half-life of 2 to 20 years, guess what? Look, they just keep accumulating in the body. So you look at all these things, as people get older, the levels go up. And once you get to about age 50, the levels are now so high and there's been so much damage, the body starts to lose its protective mechanisms. So a lot of the research that I've looked at the correlation of body load of a particular environmental toxin and particular disease I'm looking at. Up until about the age 45 to 50, the correlation is not very strong. But once you get to age 50, all the correlations just take off. Because at that point, our DNA has been so damaged. Our protective mechanisms have been so overwhelmed. The body load of these persistent organic toxins have gone up so much, now we can't protect ourselves and now get all this disease. So where are the toxins coming from? As near as I can tell, I'm not aware of any study that definitively looked at this. I'm just kind of putting together all the studies I've looked at to see what makes sense. Where they come from? 60% is coming from food, 10% is coming from water, 10% from house and yard chemicals, 10% from health and beauty aids, 5% from air. Now, if you're living near a coal burning plant for producing energy, well, you're gonna get a lot more toxins from the air. Okay, if you're living in a farming community, it was get a lot more toxins from water. Remember those pictures I showed about the organophosphates in the water supplies of big portions of the United States. Water, if you have any one of those areas, high levels of arsenic. For example, if you live in Maine and you're living on a well, you've got to get your arsenic checked. There are some wells in Maine that had 3,000 micrograms of arsenic per liter of water. How they find out? Huge incidence of strokes and cancer and heart disease in people in that particular area. So wait, what's going on? Oh, arsenic in the water. So it's got to be checked. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about avoidance. I'm not going to be talking about a miracle drug, a miracle herb, a miracle vitamin. I'm going to talk about everyday things we should be doing. I'm going to talk about this because you're part of my tribe. We're part of the same tribe. And while we talk about all these interventions we want to do for our patients, we need to be doing this ourselves. Physician, heal thyself. Okay. As I walk through these conferences, and I see as many people at this conference are getting older, we're developing the same diseases the population around us is developing. Not as bad. We're taking better care of ourselves, but I want to say to people, let's take even better care of ourselves. And I'm telling you the things that I am doing. And why do I think this is effective? So there's a liver enzyme we can measure called GGT or GGTP, same enzyme, different names. It used to be tested as a standard test to determine if a person had liver inflammation. Okay, because when the liver gets inflamed, the cells start leaking enzymes and levels go up. ALT and all these various enzymes, and one was GGTP. It's not being measured as much anymore because it goes up for other reasons. And so other reasons it goes up, why it's so important. It turns out that GGT goes up in proportion to oxidative stress and in proportion to toxic load. And why is that? Because GGT recycles glutathione. So our smart bodies, when we're exposed to environmental toxins, upregulates production of GGT, and so they can produce more glutathione recycling to help protect us better from this oxidative stress, the environmental toxins. So now there's one little caveat here, and that is about 10% of the population does not increase GGT proportion to toxic load, and they're what I would call the yellow canaries. They're the ones who get environmental toxins, way higher incidence. Again, environmental damage from environmental toxins much more readily than general population. So now one of the measures I use to determine how well a person is doing in decreasing their toxic load is I measure GGTP. So when I first started testing this way back 15 years ago in this group in Alberta, or in Canada, Alberta, they're not just Alberta, we've got some British Columbia and some Saskatchewan, but we'll just say Alberta for main ones. So we tested not only these 4,500 oil field workers, but also all the MDs and all the staff people who were involved in the project. And my GGTP was 27. I thought that was pretty good. The average GGT in the population we're testing was in the low 30s, okay? And we had some people clearly way too high. But I thought 27 is not too bad. But then as I started testing more and more, looking at more and more research, correlating GGT with environmental toxins, I said, I'm gonna get better. So I started getting better, measured myself about 5 years ago, I was down to 23, I'm on the right track. Measured myself 3 years ago, I was down to 17. I just measured last month, I was down to 16. So what I'm able to tell you is doing these things decreases our oxidative load and decreases our toxic load more effectively than any intervention we can do. That's taking a vitamin or a mineral or an herb or a drug. We got to stop the sources of the toxins, and we can do it. So here's what we do. I want to start with something really simple. When my wife started doing this 20 years ago or 30 years ago, everybody thought we were crazy. No, we were right. Something just as simple as taking off your shoes before going into your house. Pure and simple. So this is looking at a house that was near a farm that was being sprayed. And this is when they walked into their house, how much, I lost one of my axis thing. Anyway, we'll just look at the relative amount. I see walking into the house with shoes, they got a unit of 6, the 2,4-D that was in their bodies. They took off their shoes. This is what it got down to. And this is what it looked like in the house before they sprayed the neighboring field with these pesticides. Okay, so as you can see, big numbers. You might say, well, I'm not living next to a farm. Well, do your next door neighbors spray their lawns with these various chemicals so they look nice and green? Are they spraying their plants and the area around, not the plants, but the area around their plants with glyphosate laden Roundup and things of this nature? The problem is the whole environment is contaminated. You do everything we can to reduce it, and we can't just assume that because we're be careful about the food we're eating, we're avoiding our toxins. It's coming from the water, it's coming from the air. How about fish? There's a 100-fold variation between the big fish and small fish, the amount of mercury. So fish is a good source of protein, but it's got to be small fish like sardines, anchovies, small salmon, all wild caught. Here's an example of why you don't want to eat farmed fish. The more farmed fish people eat, the more of these persistent organic pollutants in our bodies, the more disease we suffer. Why do farmed fish have so much PCBs? Because of the foods we're feeding these fish. They're high in PCBs. I assume we're all aware of the Environmental Working Group. They have the Dirty Dozen, the Clean 15. So this is showing which of the foods most contaminated with environmental toxins, which are the foods where you don't have to worry about them being organically grown in terms of environmental toxins. Now, you do have to worry about them in terms of all these phytonutrients, because the phytonutrients can be lower, at least not going to have as much toxins. And the most important thing you do, though, is eat organically. Here's a study done in Seattle where they looked at children whose families were eating organically compared to children whose families were eating chemically. What they found was the kids eating chemically grown foods had a 9-fold increased incidence of organophosphates in their blood. And when it was done in the urine, but they did study the blood, the same thing. What do organophosphates do? They're neurotoxins. As organophosphate levels go up in pregnant mothers, IQ of their children goes down. We don't have that in children. We have it in the mothers. What we do also have is as the amount of organophosphates in the blood goes up, so there's an incidence of ADHD in children. The good news is that just 3 days of only eating organically grown foods is enough to drop the level of these toxins in the blood by 9%. So the answer is it does work. Now, unfortunately, these things are mainly more fat soluble, so they're still saturating the tissues. So you won't get the clinical results yet, but we will be getting a progressive improvement in people's health. Now, the next thing to do is not is it good to eat organically grown foods, but join a farm share. Now, the big advantage of a farm share is you're getting locally grown foods that you're eating seasonally. So locally grown foods can be rich in nutrients your body's expecting to be there because that's how we evolved as a species. Okay, so this is a nice way of doing it. Now, my wife and I did this for a while, and while it worked pretty well, we also found that, we had food preferences and we weren't always getting the foods that we wanted. So now we've learned to grow our own food. So folks, I'm going to say to you, learn to grow your own food. You don't have to have a lot of property. Maybe there's a local community farm that you can join. Maybe you just have a deck. You can put some plants on. You can put some pots on to grow things. But it works, folks. So here we have in our kitchen, we have the stainless steel pot. Okay, and every food that we only eat organically grown foods. If it's not organically grown food, we occasionally have to purchase because we can't find anything else. It doesn't go in here. We put this in here, and every few days we put it into our compost. Now, I apologize for those who don't already do this, but I suspect a lot of people don't. And you're part of my tribe, want you to be healthy. Okay, we want to do the same thing for our patients. So we have these 2 little rotating composters. So for 6 months, we put everything into one composter. By the way, we put a lot of leaves in there. Put a lot of leaves in there with your garden scraps. The compost, it takes about 6 months. So while this one, we're putting stuff in, this one's sitting and percolating. And when it's done, I empty this out, put it into our garden, which grows this wonderful food, okay? And then we start the other one. It's just pretty easy to do. So in conclusion, neurotoxins are ubiquitous in the industrialized world. Toxins are the primary drivers, not just of neurodegeneration, mood disorders, etc., but the primary drivers of the chronic disease epidemic we're suffering all over the world. Toxins can be avoided and excretion can be facilitated. The best way to get increased facilitated environmental toxins, increase fiber intake. How to increase fiber intake? By eating real foods, particularly fruits and vegetables like I was just showing you. and then increased consumption of the colorful foods because they protect us from these toxins. Now, the final thing I want to say here, I want to emphasize, is the importance of patience. So we've kind of trained our population to expect that when they get an intervention from the doctor, like a drug, they're going to feel better within hours to days. And think about it. You have an inflamed joint for whatever reason, sprained your ankle, take aspirin, ibuprofen, within minutes to hours, you're feeling better. Now we're going to more natural kinds of therapies. Well, we're doing herbal medicine. It can have drug-like effects. It can have nutritional effects, but we're not going to expect results until weeks. When we start doing nutritional medicine, well, it's going to take typically months to get the benefit, because we now have to get the body levels up high enough for things to work properly, and it takes time to get body levels up. But when we're doing environmental toxin work, you first have to identify the toxin, topic exposure, help body get rid of the toxins. Some toxins don't become apparent until other toxins are removed. So often you won't see the long-term persistent toxins until non-persistent toxins have been reduced enough. So now you see these toxins. Okay, once you get those toxins out of the body, now the enzymes that have been poisoned have to be replaced, and then those enzymes can do the job to start healing the body. So when we're doing environmental medicine work, the results typically take months to even years to get the benefits. Some of the patients with the worst neurotoxins that I treated, it took 6 months of getting neurotoxins out before they started finally seeing the neurological benefits. And to help assist as I can, I've created 2 books for people. One is the textbook, Clinical Environmental Medicine, with Walter Crinion for the doctors. And then I wrote the book, The Toxin Solution for Consumers, to help people understand how they can better take care of themselves. So thank you for your kind attendance to this lecture. I've left 10 minutes for, 9 minutes now, for any questions and answers you may have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pizzorno. That was amazing and slightly depressing, but also very heartening in the sense that you are living proof that you've managed to lower your GGT. So that's fantastic and gives us all hope. There are a whole number of questions, so I will start with the upvoted ones. Where would you recommend providers get professional training on detox protocols for heavy metal toxicity?
Great question. Right now, I'm developing a program for Fullscript where I'm giving people a primer on environmental medicine. And from that, I'll be developing a more in-depth certificate course that'll provide people an online experience with interactions with me to make it more in-depth. I don't have that in place yet, so I can't really talk a lot about it. In the meantime, I would say at the very top of your list should be any lecture being given by doctors Fine and Patrick. They are 2 of the most expert people in the world on environmental medicine. They give a lot of lectures. I would look for any lecture being given by Dr. David Quigg. Dr. Quigg works for Doctors Data in Chicago. They're one of the labs I recommend. I don't have a commercial relationship with them, but when I was doing my corporate wellness program, I did split samples with all the labs at that time that were doing laboratory testing, and they were by far the most accurate in metals. So any lecture David gives on metals, it can be a reliable lecture.
Awesome, thank you. What are the best testing methods for different metals? Do you recommend provoked or non-provoked?
Yes. So that's one of the most difficult questions to answer. One of the problems we have as a community is we need more research dollars. 99.9% of research dollars go to fund studying conventional medicine approaches. We need to test our approaches. There are no good studies I'm aware of that show that challenge testing is accurate. Now, having said that, I did a little study myself that I haven't published, and I probably should. We took 65 office workers. We measured their blood levels of mercury. We measured the urine levels of mercury. We did challenge testing and did challenge testing levels of mercury. And then we counted the number of fillings in their mouth. As you know, the number of fillings in the mouth, they're so-called silver fillings, mercury, which basically mercury amalgam, 55% mercury. There's a direct correlation between the number of fillings in the mouth and the amount of mercury in the brain. Okay, so we looked at which test best predicted the number of fillings in the mouth, and provoked testing was most accurate at predicting the number of fillings in the mouth. But having said that, the error range was high. Our value was only like 0.33, which is not very good. But it was better than blood or better than urine, than first-born urine.
Great. If buying organic food from stores, what is the best way to wash these foods? Or veggie wash is safe? And I presume that's also goes for non-organic foods.
Yes. So the good news is that indeed washing non-organic foods will remove a pretty significant portion of the pesticides, because most of the pesticides are on the surface of the food. And typically an acid or slightly oxidating formula will do it. So for example, a mild vitamin C wash, a mild vinegar wash are actually pretty effective. So in my textbook, Clinical Environmental Medicine, we actually have a table with references showing how much each particular kind of washing will remove each particular kind of toxin. It turns out different toxins are removed best by different washing methodologies. So I recommend taking a look at that table.
Brilliant. I noticed GGT used to be on a CMP with AST and ALT, but at some point it was removed from most major lab panels, and now only AST and ALT are measured. GGT needs to be ordered separately. I wonder if many people have elevations and why it was removed.
Yes, so it is removed because its purpose was primarily to look at liver inflammation, liver damage. And it turns out the other ones were more accurate because, as I said, GTTP was measuring other things. I think it's pretty interesting. In the past, it worked great. But as we toxified our population, GGT kept going up because of toxicity, became less predictive of liver damage.
Got it. Do you prefer urine or blood MMA testing?
Blood.
Okay. Given that glyphosate can extend far beyond where it is used, are organic foods actually safe versus foods grown where Roundup is used?
I know what they're talking about. So if you have an organic farm next to a chemical farm, that chemical farm is going to get some organophosphates in it and Roundup and things like that. There's no way around it. So the answer is yes. That's non-ideal. What we want is do the farm shares where we can support farms that are away from other farms can do it properly. But yeah, it's a problem. And that's also one reason why I recommend farm shares and growing your own food, is because you go to Trader Joe's. I buy organic food from Trader Joe's, but some of it's shipped from Chile, for example. And so the further it's shipped, the more likely it is to be contaminated. And the further you get from your local control and ability to look over somebody's shoulder to see what they're doing, the more likely it is there could be some shortcuts taken you may not really want with how your food's being produced.
Got it. Does mask wearing help with this, with air toxins? Did any studies happen during the pandemic on this?
I looked at, so if you go into PubMed and put my name and COVID, I wrote an editorial. I'm in the middle of a two-part editorial. Now I'm doing the really hard part. First part of the editorial, it's called What Worked for COVID and What Didn't. The first part I looked at masks, lockdowns, vitamin D, washing hands, things like that. And near as I can tell, masks did not work. As a matter of fact, the more people wore the mask, the more other diseases they got. So not particularly effective.
Interesting.
Now, but having said that, I want to recommend to everybody in their own home, they put in a MERV 12 or better filter, because we have a lot of the toxins. If you live in the city or live within 100 yards of a highway, we're getting a lot of particulate matter. And so having a good quality air filtration system in the house to get rid of the PM 2.5 is a really smart idea.
Got it. Can Parkinson's be reversed after long-term exposure to toxins like at Camp Lejeune?
It's a good question. And there's research showing people with Parkinson's given IV glutathione and showing short-term benefit. A short-term being they saw benefits up to 30 days after the use of glutathione. So what they're doing there is they're dramatically decreasing oxidative stress in the neurons. But the problem with these tests is they didn't go through and work on getting rid of all the neurotoxins and such. So you cover up the symptom without dealing with the cause. So my belief is that if you're able to get rid of all those neurotoxins and get the glutathione levels up, you're going to have some improvement. How much can we regenerate remains to be seen, but we can regenerate at least some.
Great. What do you recommend to low-income people who can't afford organic or even healthy non-organic food?
So that's where the environmental working groups list is so useful. So those Clean 15, they can eat those foods. And then by rinsing them off with the vinegar or vitamin C water, they can decrease their toxic load that way. It's not ideal, not as good as we'd like, but it's a step in the right direction. Big step in the right direction.
Do you recommend checking urinary environmental toxins through Mosaic, and do you prefer hair or urinary heavy metal testing?
Right. So I'm a scientific consultant for Mosaic, so I have conflict of interest. But the reason I work with them is because they came to me and say, "Hey, we're going to develop a bunch of new lab tests with urine. Would you help us?" And I said, "Well, absolutely. I know there's a lot of things I want you to measure." So my Mosaic right now, I'm strongly recommending them. And then for heavy metals, urine right now is going to be our best method. What we really want to do, so I want to know how much damage mercury is causing to a person. Well, I want to stick a needle into their head, into the brain, take some brain tissue out and see how much mercury is in it. People don't want you to put needles into their brains. Okay, so we're kind of stuck with urine. Now, blood is probably better, but so much less convenient to deal with. That urine turns out to be pretty useful clinically.
Got it. So I think, there are a few more questions, but I think what we will do, there's one more. I heard that glyphosate is a desiccant and used to dry freshly harvested chickpeas. Is hummus a worse food as a result?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Anyway, well, Dr. Pizzorno, that was amazing. I don't want to end the whole conference on a downer, but there is definitely hope, because you've shown us that you've lowered your GGT over the years, and I'm sure you've done some other wonderful things for your biochemistry and your mental health. But thank you so, so much for that. It concludes a whirlwind overview for the past 3 days of the many factors which contribute to mental illness and various therapies to treat them. We've seen from nervous system regulation, nutritional psychiatry, hormones, metabolic interventions, novel brain therapies, psychedelics, infections and toxins, the gut-brain connection. And I'm incredibly heartened by the breadth and depth of approaches to diagnose and treat the root causes of so many of these mental health imbalances, and also by the attention this medicine of the future is getting, illustrated by the over 400 attendees who've registered both live and recorded for this conference. And we really all need to work together to get this much more into the mainstream. So I'm really grateful to you all. Thank you all who've registered for investing 3 days of your time to learn about this type of medicine. Thank you to our wonderful speakers who are dedicating their lives to learning, practicing, and teaching this medicine of the future. Thank you to everyone who's helped to spread the word about this conference and our work. Thank you to my team at Mind Health 360 and at IMMH, to Pessy for making this conference run so smoothly. Last but not least, thank you to our sponsors for their generous support. And please do go visit one final time the virtual attendee hall. Don't forget to post on social media, join our IMMH Facebook and Instagram group that we've just launched. And most importantly, really looking forward to seeing you all next year, 9th to the 13th of October in Washington, D.C. for IMMH 2024 in person, which will be amazing. And in the meantime, just look after yourselves and your loved ones. Keep spreading healing to a world that really very badly needs it. So on that note, we are done. So we conclude this conference. Dr. Pizzorno, thank you so much for being such a leader in your field and for doing so much. And thank you all for your time.
Thank you.